The night I drove home, I found a party instead of an argument. Relatives laughed under string lights. My belongings tossed on the lawn like a dead estate. They thought public humiliation would make me crawl back to sign their papers. They never realized the parasite they evicted was keeping their lives afloat. Exactly 2 weeks later, as late notices multiplied, they finally understood. They had not kicked out a burden, they had evicted their life support. My name is Addison Garcia. I am 34 years old, and on the night my family decided to throw me away, I was just exhausted. I was driving back to our family home in Arbor Creek, Arizona, after finishing a grueling 10-hour late shift at North Basin Compliance Group. The drive was quiet. My mind was rehearsing the usual defensive maneuvers I needed just to walk through the front door. I fully expected to find Victor waiting up, nursing a light beer, ready to deliver his standard midnight lecture about how I was not living a mature enough life. I was bracing for the heavy sighs, the pointed remarks about my living under his roof, the subtle implications that my existence was a charity case he was growing weary of funding. I turned onto our street and immediately noticed the glow. It was not the porch light. It was the blinding, festive glare of patio string lights strung across the front gutters. Music thumped from a portable speaker. As my headlights swept across the yard, the reality of the scene came into sharp, agonizing focus. My life was on the lawn. It was not just tossed out in garbage bags, it was displayed. Suitcases were splayed open, their contents spilling into the dewy grass. Clear plastic storage bins were overturned. My books, the ones I had collected since college, were piled haphazardly, their covers bending awkwardly under the weight. My winter coats were draped over the prickly hedges like discarded rags. Worst of all were the file boxes from my old metal filing cabinet. They had been violently dumped, sending a cascade of manila folders, receipts, and personal documents fluttering across the yard. I killed the engine. The silence in the car was deafening compared to the noise outside. I stepped out, my work shoes crunching on the gravel driveway, and looked up at the front porch. Hanging between the pillars, painted in thick, crude, black lettering on an old bedsheet, was a handmade banner. It read, "Finally, free of the parasite." Underneath the banner, standing on the porch with a red plastic cup in her hand, was my Aunt Dana Hurst. She threw her head back and laughed at something the neighbor said, raising her cup in a mock toast. She looked like she was at a summer block party, celebrating a holiday. The holiday, apparently, was my public execution. Near the edge of the driveway, my father, Victor Garcia, stood proudly by his beloved gas grill. He was holding court with two of his bowling buddies. I could hear his booming voice over the music. He was calling it his taking back the house night. He puffed out his chest, reveling in the attention, playing the role of the long-suffering patriarch who had finally put his foot down. I looked for my mother. Lorraine Garcia was standing by the cooler on the lower step. She did not have a drink. She was not cheering, but she was not doing a single thing to stop it. Her face was set in a tight, practiced expression of mild discomfort, a look she perfected over decades to pretend she was a victim of Victor's tempers rather than his enabler. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second, then immediately looked down at the concrete, washing her hands of the cruelty playing out in front of her. Then I saw my younger sister, Noelle Garcia. She was leaning against the porch railing, completely silent, but her silence was the most lethal part of the scene. She was holding her phone out, the screen glowing against her face. She was panning the camera slowly across the scattered debris on the lawn, zooming in on the banner, then turning the lens toward me as I stood frozen in the driveway. I saw her thumb tapping the screen, a live stream. She was broadcasting this to our extended family, our mutual friends, the entire town of Arbor Creek. This was not a sudden, drunken rage. This was not a temporary fight that got out of hand. The banner, the invited guests, the perfectly angled camera, it meant this was premeditated, a calculated ambush. I walked slowly onto the grass. The guests stopped talking. The music seemed to fade into the background as every eye locked onto me. They were waiting for the explosion, They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to drop to my knees and cry, to beg Victor for forgiveness, to plead with Lorraine to let me back inside. They wanted a show. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my chest. My vision narrowed. I did not give them a single tear. As I stepped carefully over my scattered belongings, a splash of white caught my eye. Half buried under a pile of my sweaters was a thick manila envelope I recognized immediately. It had been ripped open. I knelt down and pulled it free. The papers inside were partially sliding out. I recognized the bold blue letterhead immediately. Sunline Exterior Services, Victor's contracting company. Peeking out from beneath the corporate logo were the undeniable headers of commercial loan applications and personal credit guarantor authorization forms. The signature lines were blank, waiting for a name. My name. Suddenly, the entire circus made sense. The pieces locked together in my mind with a sickening click. I did not yell. I did not confront Victor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I ignored Noelle's glowing screen. I opened my camera app and turned the flash on. I walked methodically across the yard. Click. A bright flash illuminated the overturned bins. Click. The banner hanging on the porch. Click. Aunt Dana Hurst's frozen. Suddenly uncomfortable face. Click. Lorraine looking away. Click. Victor. His smug grin faltering just a fraction as the stark white light hit his eyes. And finally, click. A crystal clear, high-resolution photo of the torn envelope and the loan documents resting on the grass. I took a small duffel bag that had not been emptied, stuffed my laptop and a few essential items into it, and tucked the manila envelope of loan papers under my arm. The silence in the yard was heavy, suffocating. They did not know the script anymore. The parasite was supposed to beg, not conduct a crime scene investigation. I turned my back on the porch and began walking toward my car. The gravel crunched under my feet again. As I passed the edge of the driveway, I heard a voice. It was Victor, leaning in close to one of his friends. He kept his voice low, a conspiratorial whisper meant only for the men standing beside him, but the desert night air carried the sound perfectly to my ears. He said, "Tonight she learns how to be grateful." I stopped with my hand on the car door handle. The words hung in the air, revealing the massive, arrogant miscalculation he had just made. He actually believed this. He believed that leaving me with nothing would break my spirit. He thought that by humiliating me in front of the people I had known my entire life, I would drive away in shame, sleep in my car for 2 or 3 days, and return to that front door completely broken. He was certain I would crawl back, eager to apologize, desperate for a roof over my head, and most importantly, ready to blindly sign whatever financial death warrant. Sunline Exterior Services needed to stay afloat. This was never an eviction. It was a siege. It was a crude, brutal extortion tactic designed to bring me to my knees. I opened my car door, threw the duffel bag onto the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. I put the car in reverse, backed out of the driveway, and drove away from Arbor Creek without looking in the rearview mirror. I did not feel like a victim being thrown to the wolves. As I merged onto the dark highway, gripping the steering wheel, I realized Victor had made a fatal error. He thought he was cutting off my lifeline. He did not realize I was his. He wanted me to learn gratitude. In exactly 14 days, when the house began to starve, the whole family would learn the true cost of a signature. The drive to the south side of Arbor Creek took 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing a continental divide. I found a short-term rental in a decaying brick building squeezed between a discount tire shop and a shuttered diner. The landlord, a heavy-set man who smelled of stale tobacco, took my deposit in cash and handed me a single brass key without asking why a woman was renting a studio at 2 a.m. with nothing but a duffel bag, a laptop, and a battered cardboard file box. The apartment was little more than a box itself, a peeling laminate floor, a mattress on a rusty metal frame, and a kitchen counter barely wide enough to hold a coffee maker. But as I locked the deadbolt behind me, a profound, heavy silence settled over the room. It was the first true silence I had experienced in 10 years. No heavy footsteps stomping down the hallway. No television blaring sports from the living room. No hushed, angry whispers about who forgot to pay the water bill. Just the low, mechanical hum of the ancient refrigerator. I did not sleep. I sat cross-legged on the cold laminate floor, placing my laptop in front of me and pulling the cardboard file box close. This box was the only piece of my past I had actively fought to save from the lawn. It was not filled with sentimental photographs or childhood keepsakes. It was filled with receipts. I opened my phone and started scrolling through my text message history with my family. Without the noise of their voices, the digital record was a cold, indisputable testament to my actual role in that house. I read messages from Lorraine asking if I could just pick up the grocery tab this week, because Victor was waiting on a client check. I saw frantic texts from Noelle begging me to cover her car insurance premium because she spent her paycheck on a weekend trip. I found dozens of quick, dismissive messages from Victor, always variations of the same phrase. Cover this just till Friday. Friday never came. I moved from the texts to my banking app, then to my email inbox. I began to pull crumpled invoices and folded statements from the cardboard box, smoothing them out on the floor. I was not just looking at money. I was conducting an autopsy on a decade of exploitation. For years, I believed I was just helping out with petty cash, a $50 gas tank here, a $200 grocery run there. But as I lined up the digital receipts next to the physical papers, the illusion shattered. I was not chipping in. I was the silent, invisible infrastructure keeping the entire family from collapsing under the weight of their own incompetence. I saw the automated payment confirmations for the house electricity, the gas, and the internet. I found the emails reminding me that the commercial liability insurance for Sunline Exterior Services was due. I saw the state registry notices for Victor's business license renewals. I was the one who calendared the quarterly estimated tax deadlines for his company, because he claimed he was too busy working in the field to handle paperwork. My email address was the primary point of contact for every single utility, every insurance broker, and every debt collector that orbited my family. I was the human firewall standing between them and ruin. A sharp spike of adrenaline hit me as I checked my active bank links. My primary debit card was currently tied to 3 separate auto-pay accounts for the house in Arbor Creek. They were set to draw funds in less than 48 hours. The lingering sting of the public humiliation vanished, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. I was a survivor surveying a disaster zone, and the first rule of survival was to stop the bleeding. I opened a new browser window. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I logged into the electric company portal, navigated to the billing section, and deleted my card information. I changed the account password and removed my email address from the contact profile, leaving only Victor's outdated, rarely checked webmail account. I repeated the process for the water company. I went into the telecom provider site and severed my payment method from the family internet plan. I did not stop there. I logged into the shared streaming services, the warehouse club memberships, and the pharmacy delivery apps. I purged my name, my billing addresses, and my credit card numbers from every digital platform my family utilized. I severed the invisible umbilical cord they had been feeding through for years. When the digital purge was complete, I turned my attention to the physical papers scattered around me on the floor. I needed to build my armor. I opened a fresh pack of manila folders I had bought weeks ago and began categorizing the chaos. I labeled the first folder Utilities. Into it went every paid receipt for power and water spanning back to 2018. The second folder I titled Mortgage Rescue. This one grew thick quickly. It held the bank transfer confirmations from the 4 separate occasions Victor had fallen 3 months behind on the house note, forcing me to drain my savings to stop the foreclosure process. I created a medical folder for Lorraine's prescription copays and out-of-pocket specialist visits that she claimed the insurance would not cover. I made a Noelle tuition folder, filled with the community college fees and cosmetology certification deposits I had funded because Victor said his cash flow was tied up in materials. Finally, I wrote business emergencies on the last folder. This was the heaviest of all. It contained the vendor invoices I had paid to keep Sunline Exterior Services from being sued by suppliers. By the time the sun began to peek through the dusty blinds of the studio window, painting the peeling walls in a pale gray light. The floor was organized. The chaos of my family had been reduced to 5 neat, categorized stacks of evidence. I was no longer an emotional wreck. I was a ledger. Just after 8 in the morning, my phone vibrated on the counter. The screen lit up with a message from Noelle. I picked it up, expecting a continuation of the previous night's drama, perhaps a defensive justification or a demand to know where I was. Instead, the message was breathtakingly casual. "Internet is down. Did you cancel something?" I stared at the glowing letters. There was no apology for standing on the porch and broadcasting my humiliation to the world. There was no inquiry about my safety, no guilt about tossing my life onto the wet grass. There was only a profound, selfish annoyance that her morning routine had been interrupted. She was irritated that the invisible system providing her comfort had suddenly stopped running. In that exact moment, staring at my sister's text, the cruelest truth of the entire ordeal crystallized in my mind. They never intended to kick me out. They did not want to lose me. The luggage on the lawn, the cruel banner, the laughing relatives, it was all a theatrical production designed to shatter my boundaries. They believed that if they shamed me deeply enough, if they made me feel small and isolated and worthless, I would eventually creep back into the house with my head down. They wanted me to be so grateful just to be allowed back inside that I would stop complaining, stop asking for repayment, and quietly sign the commercial loan guarantees Victor needed to save his sinking business. They wanted to strip away my dignity so I would be easier to control. They did not want to banish the parasite. They just wanted the parasite to stop resisting its host. I locked my phone screen without typing a reply. I placed the device face down on the kitchen counter next to the dripping faucet. I looked back at the 5 manila folders resting on the floor. They thought they had left me with nothing, but sitting in that quiet, empty room, I realized I had walked away with the only thing that actually held power. I had the records. I had the truth. And for the first time in my adult life, I had absolute control over the one resource they desperately needed to survive: me. The first 4 days following my departure were marked by an eerie, heavy silence. I did not receive a barrage of angry text messages or demanding voicemails right away. The sheer arrogance of the Garcia household dictated that they wait for my inevitable surrender. They truly believed I was sleeping in the back seat of my sedan, rationing fast food, just waiting for the sting of pride to wear off before I crawled back. But Arbor Creek is a small, tightly knit ecosystem where secrets have a very short shelf life. Gossip travels much faster than the dry desert wind, and soon enough, the fragments of their unraveling reality began to reach me. I gathered the pieces of the puzzle not from direct confrontation, but from the whispers of neighbors, the confused inquiries of old acquaintances, and one highly revealing mistake by a local vendor. The picture of their rapid collapse came into focus with the speed and precision of falling dominoes. The broadband internet connection was the first casualty, exactly as Noelle had unwittingly confirmed. But a dark router was merely a minor inconvenience compared to what followed. The city water department does not care about family pride or neighborhood status. They operate strictly on 30-day past due balances. A neighbor bumped into me in the produce aisle of the local grocery store on day 6 and casually mentioned seeing a bright pink warning notice taped to the front door of my childhood home. For over 5 years, I was the invisible sentinel monitoring the digital perimeter of that house. I was the one intercepting the warning emails sent to my old inbox. Whenever Victor spent the utility money on new golf clubs or a misguided investment, I would quietly transfer $80 or $120 from my own checking account to keep the taps flowing. I hid the delinquency from him so he would not throw a tantrum about the cost of living. Without me there to silently bridge the gap, those final warning emails vanished into an unmonitored void. That physical pink notice on the front door was the first public declaration of their gross negligence. Then came the vendor call on day 8, the incident that exposed the bleeding edge of Victor's business crisis. My burner phone rang while I was making coffee. It was a supplier for Sunline Exterior Services who had not bothered to update their primary contact sheet. The frantic, apologetic voice on the other end gave me the hardest piece of evidence yet. Sunline operated on a razor-thin margin of trust, a delicate balance I had meticulously maintained from the shadows. A mandatory premium for his worker compensation insurance policy had officially lapsed. It was a vital payment I routinely processed on the 15th of every month. Victor had undoubtedly ignored the mailed warning notices, operating under the blind assumption that my invisible hand would handle the paperwork just as it always had. Because the policy lapsed, a major general contractor immediately froze a highly lucrative commercial roofing subcontract. They strictly refused to let Victor's crew onto the active job site without updated certificates of liability. The main financial artery of the family was clamped shut, entirely due to an administrative oversight that would have taken exactly 5 minutes and a basic debit card transaction to resolve. Victor always paraded around our town as the quintessential self-made provider. He loved playing the alpha breadwinner who carried the weight of the world on his broad, capable shoulders. Now, suddenly thrust into the mundane reality of back-end operations, his tough facade cracked under the pressure. I heard through the local industry grapevine that he was actively screaming at supply house managers and cursing out insurance brokers over the phone. He was drowning in the ocean of invisible labor he had always dismissed as simple typing or basic secretarial work. He could not locate his own state tax identification numbers. He did not know his commercial account passwords. The mighty patriarch of the Garcia family was being completely defeated by basic administrative competence. The dominoes fell inward, crushing the softer targets too. On the 10th day of my absence, the absolute final deadline for Noelle to pay the registration fee for her state cosmetology licensing exam came and went. The fee was exactly $250. The tragic part of this failure was not that the family suddenly lacked $250 in cash. The core issue was a complete lack of executive function. For her entire existence, Noelle had operated on the comfortable assumption that a responsible adult would sweep her path clear of any logistical obstacles. I was the one who tracked her academic calendar. I set the reminder alerts on my own phone. I was the one who physically typed the credit card numbers into the state testing portal. Left entirely to her own devices, she simply forgot. The critical deadline vanished into the ether of her endless social media scrolling. She delayed the start of her entire career by a minimum of 6 months, not because of sudden poverty, but because of pure, unadulterated laziness and an addiction to being managed by others. The ripples of my sudden absence extended far beyond the immediate household walls. The extended family, the very audience members who had cheered at my metaphorical execution on the lawn, quickly began to feel the uncomfortable pinch of reality. Aunt Dana Hurst, the woman who had laughed the loudest while raising her plastic cup in a mock toast, suddenly found herself in a sheer panic standing at the pharmacy counter. 2 years prior, I had sacrificed an entire Saturday navigating a labyrinthine pharmaceutical discount program just to get her expensive blood pressure medication subsidized. I tracked down the application forms, provided the necessary tax documentation, and set up the annual renewal matrix in my own planner. Now, the narrow renewal window had opened, and the local pharmacy was demanding the full, uninsured price of $400 for a 30-day supply. Word reached me from a mutual friend that Aunt Dana was calling Lorraine incessantly, sobbing uncontrollably about the massive cost, demanding to know how to log into the online medical portal. Lorraine, predictably, had absolutely no idea how the system worked. The comfortable free ride I had quietly provided to the extended family had spectacularly derailed. The cruelest irony of the entire situation was the rapid evaporation of their social safety net. On the night of the eviction party, the front lawn was packed with loud uncles, gossiping cousins, and drinking buddies, all eager to participate in Victor's grand display of dominance. But as the second week came to a close and genuine financial panic set in, Victor had to start making desperate phone calls. The lapsed insurance premium needed to be reinstated immediately. The city water bill required a hefty lump sum payment to remove the brass padlock from the meter. He desperately needed a fast bridge loan of $5,000 just to keep the company trucks gassed up and the remaining crew paid. Suddenly, the lively, supportive crowd from the porch was nowhere to be found. Aunt Dana stopped answering Lorraine's calls entirely after the pharmacy fiasco. The bowling buddies suddenly experienced unexpected household expenses of their own and could not spare a dime. The uncles offered empty thoughts and shallow prayers instead of actual wire transfers. My family learned a brutal, unforgiving economic lesson in real time. Cruel laughter at a lawn party is completely free. Writing a personal check to save a sinking ship requires actual loyalty, and that was something Victor Garcia had never truly earned from anyone. Back in my small, quiet studio apartment, a profound and permanent transformation was taking place inside my own mind. I was sleeping deeply, easily logging 7 or 8 uninterrupted hours every single night. The chronic, burning ache in my shoulders, a physical tension I had carried like a lead weight for over a decade, finally began to melt away into nothing. My newfound peace was not born from malice or spite. I did not sit alone in the dark, cackling over the fact that they were likely showering with expensive bottled water, or that Victor was losing major roofing contracts. There was absolutely no joy in witnessing their suffering. The overwhelming tranquility came from a much deeper, purer source. For the very first time in my adult life, I was no longer acting as the human shock absorber for other people's catastrophic choices. If a utility bill went unpaid, it was no longer my emergency to solve. If a crucial licensing deadline was missed, I did not have to scramble to fix the resulting mess. The natural, heavy consequences of their own actions were finally falling squarely onto their own shoulders, landing exactly where they belonged all along. I was finally just a silent spectator watching the storm, calmly observing a parasitic structure collapse entirely under the weight of its own gravity. The text message arrived on a late Tuesday afternoon, slicing through the heavy, stagnant air of my rented studio apartment. My phone vibrated against the cheap laminate kitchen counter, the screen illuminating the dim shadows of the room. The sender was Lorraine. The message was incredibly brief, carefully sanitized, and utterly detached from the violent reality of what she had allowed to happen on her front lawn. It read, "I just want to talk like adults." I stared at the glowing white text against the dark digital background for a long, quiet minute. I knew exactly what a phone call with my mother would entail. To call Lorraine back would be to invite a calculated flood of strategic tears. She would deploy her tired, predictable arsenal of heavy sighs and gentle, manipulative deflections. She would attempt to paint the entire night of the eviction party as a tragic, mutual misunderstanding, an unfortunate escalation of family tempers where everyone was equally at fault and everyone needed to compromise. I had absolutely zero interest in entertaining her fictional version of history. I needed the raw, unvarnished architecture of their betrayal. I needed the weakest load-bearing pillar in their collapsing house to snap under pressure. I ignored Lorraine's pathetic olive branch. Instead, I scrolled down my digital contact list, found my younger sister's name, and pressed dial. The line rang exactly half a time before Noelle picked up. The sheer, desperate speed of her answering was a glaring confession in itself. A person who believes they hold the moral high ground does not lunge for a ringing phone like a drowning victim grabbing a rope. She did not even bother to say hello. She launched instantly into a chaotic, rapid-fire monologue, her voice trembling with a frantic, unspooling energy. The house was a complete disaster zone, she babbled. Victor was out in the garage, hurling heavy metal tools across the concrete floor and screaming obscenities at the drywall. The wholesale suppliers had instituted a hard, unforgiving freeze on all the company material accounts. Everything was falling apart at the seams, and she kept repeating, over and over, that things had just gone way too far. She spoke with the wide-eyed panic of someone describing a sudden natural disaster, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that her own family had happily danced while summoning the hurricane. I did not interrupt her. I let her ramble. I let the cold, heavy silence on my end of the line draw out her rising panic. I listened to her breath hitch, waiting for me to offer my usual comforting words, to tell her I would fix it, to tell her I was on my way. When she finally ran out of breath and the silence stretched tight enough to snap, I delivered a single, sharp question. What did everyone think was going to happen after that party? The phone line went dead quiet. The absolute, suffocating silence that stretched between us across the cellular network was the loudest, most damning answer she could have possibly provided. I could hear the faint, ragged sound of her shallow breathing over the tiny speaker. It was the distinct sound of a carefully rehearsed script spontaneously combusting in her throat. She had expected me to yell. She had prepared for me to cry, to demand a groveling apology, to act like the wounded, emotional victim they needed me to be. She was entirely unprepared for a clinical, ice-cold interrogation. I kept my voice perfectly flat, entirely devoid of any sisterly warmth or lingering anger. I made the moment cut deeper. I told her I saw the torn envelope resting in the wet grass. I told her I recognized the blue commercial letterhead. I told her I saw the blank guarantor authorization forms waiting for a signature. I demanded the rest of the ugly truth. The fragile dam inside Noelle finally broke. She started sobbing, the ugly, wet tears of a coward who had finally been cornered with no escape route. The reality of their elaborate plot spilled out into the open in frantic, jagged pieces. Victor had been sitting on a massive, high-risk commercial loan application for almost a month. Sunline Exterior Services was not merely experiencing a temporary seasonal cash flow issue. The company was actively drowning in a deep black sea of unpaid vendor invoices, threatening legal letters, and vanishing contracts. He desperately needed a massive emergency cash injection just to keep the bank from seizing his commercial work trucks from the driveway. But Victor possessed a financial track record that was an absolute wasteland of delayed payments, hostile defaults, and reckless, impulsive spending. No legitimate lending institution in the entire state would touch him with a 10-foot pole. He needed a pristine guarantor to attach to the application to trick the bank. My credit score was immaculate. I was the only viable financial host left in his orbit for him to drain. Through her tears, she confessed that when I had quietly and firmly refused his casual, manipulative request to co-sign the dangerous paperwork a few weeks prior, Victor had flown into a silent, simmering rage. He could not accept that he had lost total control over his primary asset. So, he maliciously twisted my refusal to absorb his crippling debt into a toxic, manufactured narrative. He branded me a parasite to justify his own catastrophic business failures to his bowling buddies, his neighbors, and his extended relatives. The extravagant lawn spectacle was never designed to expel me from the property. It was a highly calculated, brutal psychological weapon. It was a public tribunal designed to strip me of my pride, to make me feel so utterly worthless, isolated, and ashamed that I would lose the sheer will to fight back. They wanted to break my spirit in front of the entire town so I would surrender my financial future to them. Then, Noelle made her final, fatal error. In her desperate, flailing attempt to garner sympathy and minimize her own complicity, she let the final, ugly truth slip past her lips entirely unfiltered. "We just thought you would drive off mad." She wept, her voice cracking under the weight of her own foolishness. "We figured you would sleep on a friend's couch for a couple of days. Calm down. Realize you had nowhere else to go. And then come back to settle things. To settle things." Those 3 words echoed off the cheap, peeling paint of my apartment walls. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their master plan washed over me like a wave of freezing water. They genuinely expected me to throw a brief, childish tantrum, endure a short period of highly uncomfortable exile, and then return to their front porch completely defeated. To settle things meant to open my checkbook. To settle things meant to blindly sign my name on the dotted line of their financial death warrant. They believed my desperate need for a family, no matter how toxic and abusive, was vastly stronger than my basic human instinct for self-preservation. The last lingering shadow of guilt I held regarding my silent departure instantly vaporized, replaced by a structure of pure steel. I did not raise my voice. I spoke to my younger sister with the cold, immovable detachment of a judge reading a final, unappealable verdict to a convicted criminal. "Listen to me very carefully." I said, carefully enunciating every single syllable so there could be absolutely no room for misinterpretation. I have no money for you. I will never provide my signature for Victor. I am not coming back to that house. I will never handle another piece of paperwork, answer another vendor call, or fix another mistake for your family as long as I live. Do not call this number again. I ended the call before she could formulate a single pleading syllable. I pressed the end button and placed the phone gently on the counter, feeling an overwhelming sense of liberation. I walked over to the section of the floor where my thick manila folders were perfectly aligned. I sat down, opened my laptop, and created a new, blank document. The time for simply categorizing old receipts and utility bills was over. I began to construct a timeline. I typed out the specific date of every hostile text message I had received. I logged every single financial transfer I had made from my personal savings account to save their mortgage from going into default. I documented every spoken threat and manipulative demand from the past 36 months. I detailed the exact visual nature of the unsigned loan documents left in the yard on the night of the party. I transcribed the exact words Noelle had just spoken to me on the phone, cementing her confession into the digital record. I was no longer just a wounded daughter nursing a bruised ego in a cheap apartment. I was meticulously building a comprehensive legal profile. I was laying the unshakable foundation for a war they still foolishly believed was just a minor, temporary family argument. They wanted to treat me like a hostile business transaction to be managed and exploited. They were about to receive exactly the kind of ruthless, heavily documented corporate response they had begged for. I typed until my fingers ached, transforming my painful memories into an impenetrable fortress of hard, unforgiving facts. The investigation phase in my quiet studio apartment shifted from a frantic digital purge into a cold, methodical excavation. I needed to go deeper than the current month of unpaid utility bills. I opened my banking portal on my laptop and requested the full transaction history dating back 5 entire years. I connected a cheap wireless printer I bought at a local office supply store and let it run. The machine hummed and clicked for nearly an hour, spitting out stack after stack of warm paper. I spread the sheets across the laminate floor, crawling over them with a yellow highlighter, tracing the massive, hidden fault lines of my family structure. This was not just a history of petty cash and groceries. I was unearthing a multi-year chronicle of systemic financial abuse. I found the massive wire transfer from 3 years ago, the exact day I drained my entire savings account to cover 4 months of Victor and Lorraine falling behind on their mortgage, pulling their house out of active pre-foreclosure. I found the clustered payments to the local pharmacy for the specialty medications Lorraine insisted she needed, but claimed her insurance would never cover. I highlighted the semester tuition payments and the expensive registration fees for Noelle, expenses I covered because Victor always swore his big contracting payouts were delayed by bad weather. I found the direct deposits to mechanics to replace the transmission on the primary Sunline Exterior Services work truck, and the massive upfront payments I made to wholesale lumber yards, just so Victor could start his roofing jobs. The sheer volume of the money was staggering, but the true weapon lay in the digital memo lines attached to those transfers. Whenever Victor or Lorraine had asked for these massive sums of money, they never asked for a gift. They knew I would resist giving away my hard-earned salary for nothing, to pacify me, to make the extraction process smooth and guilt-free. They used very specific language in their text messages and mobile payment requests. I cross-referenced my banking statements with my archived text messages and found the exact phrases they typed with their own hands. Loan till next Friday. Temporary help for the house. We'll pay you back after closing. They had unknowingly constructed a perfect, legally binding paper trail. They had explicitly defined these transactions as personal loans, complete with promises of repayment. They had locked themselves into a financial obligation they never actually intended to honor. As I continued to dig through my old email archives, searching for any lingering vendor accounts I might have missed, I stumbled across a thread from 2 years ago. It was a forwarded message from a regional building materials distributor. I scrolled down to the original text Victor had sent to the warehouse manager. My eyes locked onto a single sentence that made the breath catch in my throat. Victor had written, Please send all the compliance forms, billing statements, and insurance requests to my temporary operations manager, Addison. I stared at the glowing screen, utterly stunned by the magnitude of the lie. Victor had fabricated a formal corporate title for me. He had presented me to his professional network as a legitimate officer of Sunline Exterior Services to justify why a young woman was handling all of his complex administrative and financial compliance. He used my clean name and my professional competence to legitimize his chaotic operation to the outside world. Yet, inside the walls of our home, he never paid me a single dime in salary. He never acknowledged my crucial role. He simply treated me like an ungrateful, dependent child who owed him free labor for the privilege of breathing his air, while I was processing the shock of the fake corporate title. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from an old friend from high school, someone who still lived 2 streets over from the Arbor Creek house. The message contained a massive video file and a brief note saying she thought I needed to see the truth before Noelle scrubbed it from the internet. It was a screen recording of the entire live stream from the night of the eviction party. It was the raw, uncut footage, captured long before I ever pulled my car into the driveway. I pressed play. The audio was surprisingly clear. I watched the camera pan across my belongings scattered on the wet grass. But then, the lens drifted toward the porch. It captured Victor standing near his grill, holding a plastic cup, talking to Uncle Reed Hurst. The music was loud, but Victor leaned in close to his brother-in-law, and the microphone on Noelle's phone picked up his voice with devastating clarity. Victor laughed and said, "After tonight she will sign anything for some peace." I paused the video. I played that specific 5-second clip again and again. After tonight she will sign anything for some peace. That single sentence changed the entire landscape of my reality. This was no longer just a story about a toxic family dynamic or a cruel public shaming. With that recording, I possessed concrete, undeniable proof that the event on the lawn was a premeditated pressure campaign. It was a calculated act of extortion designed to inflict maximum psychological distress, to force me into signing fraudulent commercial loan guarantees. I did not waste another minute. I gathered the highlighted bank statements, the printed text messages with the loan promises, the email proving my fabricated corporate title, and a digital drive containing the uncut video file. I packed them all into a heavy leather briefcase and drove straight to the downtown business district to meet with Mara Ellison. Mara was a seasoned civil litigation attorney who specialized in complex financial disputes. She did not offer me a warm cup of tea or a sympathetic hug. She sat behind a massive oak desk, wearing a sharp gray suit, and reviewed my evidence with the cold, calculating precision of a surgeon. I sat in the leather chair opposite her and laid out the entire anatomy of my family's parasitic structure. I showed her the exact dollar amounts of the unpaid loans. I showed her the email where Victor committed corporate misrepresentation. And finally, I played the video clip of his extortion strategy out loud in the quiet office. When the clip ended, Mara folded her hands on the desk. She looked at me with a steady, uncompromising gaze. She did not promise me miracles or cinematic justice. She told me bluntly that the legal system could not punish my parents for being cruel or manipulative. The courts do not care about broken hearts. However, she confirmed something infinitely more valuable. She told me I had built a fortress of hard, indisputable evidence. We had a remarkably strong basis to draft a formal legal demand letter for the immediate repayment of the documented personal loans. The text messages and banking memos were clear admissions of debt. More importantly, she explained that we needed to aggressively terminate the implied authority Victor had been exploiting. We needed to send certified declarations to every vendor, supplier, and financial institution attached to Sunline Exterior Services, stating clearly that I was not the operations manager, I was not an authorized guarantor, and my name was permanently severed from his enterprise. I authorized her to begin drafting the documents immediately. I paid her retainer fee with a sharp, profound sense of satisfaction. When I walked out of the heavy glass doors of the law firm and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight, everything felt fundamentally different. The heavy, suffocating fog of familial obligation had completely evaporated. I was no longer the frightened, humiliated daughter crying over suitcases on a dark lawn. I had transformed into the most dangerous element in their entire fragile ecosystem. I was the only person involved in this story who held the paper trail, the dates, the financial records, and the recorded confessions. I was the keeper of the ledger, and my memory was no longer clouded by their relentless manipulation and guilt. I agreed to the meeting. I chose a bustling independent coffee shop located in the busy commercial district, miles away from the quiet, gossiping streets of Arbor Creek. The location was a strategic necessity. A crowded room filled with college students typing on laptops and professionals holding loud business meetings provided a natural barrier against screaming matches. Before giving Lorraine the address, I sent one final highly specific text message outlining the unbreakable rules of our engagement. I stated clearly that if anyone at the table told a single lie, attempted to shift the blame, or even hinted at the concept of familial duty regarding money, I would immediately stand up and walk out the door. I arrived exactly on time. Lorraine and Noelle were already seated at a small round wooden table tucked into the back corner near the hissing espresso machines. I pulled out the metal chair across from them and sat down. I did not offer a greeting. I did not go to the counter to order a drink. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited. Lorraine immediately launched into her heavily rehearsed routine. Her eyes welled up with perfectly timed tears. She leaned forward, her voice trembling with an engineered sorrow, and started issuing vague, sweeping apologies. She kept repeating the phrase that things had simply been pushed too far, completely stripping the situation of any active, malicious intent. She was trying to paint the brutal eviction as an organic tragedy, a mere misunderstanding that snowballed out of control. I did not argue with her narrative. I reached into my coat pocket, retrieved my smartphone, and placed it flat on the table between us. I unlocked the screen and opened the photo gallery. I swiped to the first high-resolution image I took that night. It showed my clothing and personal files scattered across the damp grass like garbage. I pushed the phone slightly toward her. I swiped to the next image, the crude, hateful banner hanging from the front porch pillars. I swiped one more time, the clear, undeniable photograph of Aunt Dana and the neighbors smiling and raising their plastic cups in celebration. I did not utter a single syllable. I just let the harsh, undeniable visual reality of their actions completely obliterate her soft, tearful excuses. Lorraine stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing silently. The tears stopped instantly. The deniability she was desperately trying to construct evaporated right in front of her eyes. I shifted my gaze away from my mother and locked eyes with my younger sister. Noelle immediately slumped forward, staring intently at the swirling pattern in the foam of her latte. She refused to look up. I leaned in slightly and asked her a direct, piercing question. I kept my tone perfectly level, devoid of any rising anger. What exactly did everyone think I was going to sign after being humiliated in front of our entire extended family? Noelle physically flinched at the question. She sank deeper into her chair, her shoulders practically touching her ears. She remained completely silent, unable to formulate a lie and too cowardly to state the truth in front of Lorraine. The heavy, suffocating silence hanging over our small table was a comprehensive answer in itself. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door at the front of the cafe swung open. Victor marched inside. He was purposefully late, executing a transparent dominance play designed to make us wait for his arrival. He wore his heavy work boots and a stained canvas jacket, aggressively projecting the image of a tireless provider. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not ask how I was doing or where I was living. He pulled out the fourth chair, the metal legs scraping loudly against the tile, and dropped into it. He bypassed any emotional pleasantries and immediately plunged into his financial agenda. He spoke with a rapid, pressured intensity. He announced that Sunline Exterior Services was facing a minor temporary cash flow interruption. He stated that the company urgently required a bridge note, a short-term commercial loan to cover material costs and payroll until the next big contract cleared. He leaned across the table, invading my space, and declared that I was the only person in the family who qualified to help them navigate through this bad patch. He expected me to fall back into my old role, to simply nod, accept the burden, and rescue his sinking ship. He clearly anticipated an emotional battle. He was braced for me to shout about the lawn, the banner, and the cruelty, so he could dismiss me as hysterical and unreasonable. I refused to give him the satisfaction of an argument. Instead, I opened my leather bag and retrieved a single sheet of crisp white paper. I slid it across the smooth wooden surface until it rested directly in front of his massive hands. It was not a blank guarantor form. It was a stark, itemized financial liquidation strategy. I instructed him to immediately sell the heavy-duty second work truck that had been sitting idle in the side yard for 8 months. I told him to empty and cancel the expensive climate-controlled storage unit he rented solely to hoard outdated tools and broken recreational equipment. I demanded he cut all vanity spending, including the premium cable packages and the country club social tier membership. Finally, I told him he needed to schedule a direct meeting with his commercial lender to negotiate his own debt restructuring, rather than demanding his daughter absorb the catastrophic fallout of his profound incompetence. Victor stared at the paper as if it were coated in poison. His face rapidly flushed, turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his collar. He slammed his open palm against the table, causing the ceramic coffee cups to rattle violently against their saucers. A few patrons at nearby tables turned their heads to look at the commotion. He tried to summon the booming authoritarian voice he utilized to terrify his roofing crews. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing, ready to unleash a vicious tirade about respect, family loyalty, and his ultimate authority as the patriarch. He opened his mouth to verbally bulldoze me back into submission. I did not let him speak a single word. I picked up my phone from the table. I opened the media folder, maximized the volume slider, and pressed play. The raw, unfiltered audio from the live stream cut sharply through the ambient noise of the crowded coffee shop. Victor's own voice, captured flawlessly on the night of the eviction party, played loud and clear. After tonight, she will sign anything for some peace. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous, absolute, and utterly devastating. The aggressive, domineering energy Victor had brought into the room shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Lorraine went completely pale, the blood draining from her face so fast she looked physically ill. She pressed her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with pure shock. Noelle buried her face in her arms on the table and began to genuinely sob, realizing the sheer, undeniable magnitude of the trap they were caught in. Victor froze completely. His mouth remained slightly open, but the angry roar died silently in his throat. His aggressive posture collapsed. He glared at the small black device in my hand, furious that he had been secretly recorded. But he was entirely paralyzed by the fact that he could not deny the sound of his own voice. The definitive proof of his malicious extortion plot had just been broadcast in a public space. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I pushed my chair back smoothly and stood up. I looked down at the three of them sitting around the small wooden table. They no longer looked like an imposing family unit. They looked small, fractured, and entirely devoid of leverage. I delivered my final non-negotiable terms with absolute clarity. From this exact second forward, I stated, my voice steady and cold, every single piece of communication between us must be submitted in writing. I looked directly into Victor's eyes as I delivered the final blow. I reminded them that they had made the deliberate, calculated choice to drag my name, my reputation, and my dignity out into the public square for everyone to see. They wanted an audience for their cruelty. Therefore, they would now have to face the cold, unforgiving truth entirely on the public record. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response, an excuse, or another manufactured apology. I walked out the heavy glass doors of the cafe and stepped into the bright, busy street, leaving them sitting in absolute silence with nothing but an itemized list of their failures and the echoing ghost of their own ruined scheme. 4 days after I walked out of that coffee shop, my phone chimed with a highly unusual request. It was a text from Lorraine. She asked if she could drop by my new place. She promised she was coming alone, swearing she only wanted to have a soft, gentle conversation between a mother and her daughter. Against my better judgment, I gave her the address. I did not invite her out of a sudden surge of familial longing. I allowed the visit because I needed to see exactly which angle they were going to play next. She arrived late in the afternoon. When I opened my deadbolt, she was standing in the dim hallway holding a small potted succulent in a white ceramic dish and a pastel pink cardboard box tied with a thin white string. She looked deliberately fragile. She wore an oversized beige cardigan and had foregone her usual heavy makeup, presenting the carefully curated image of a deeply exhausted, remorseful mother seeking reconciliation. I stepped aside and led her into the cramped studio. She immediately began scanning the peeling laminate floors and the single window that looked out over the discount tire shop. She placed the plant and the bakery box on my tiny kitchen counter with exaggerated care. She called the apartment cozy. That was her first lie of the afternoon. It was a shoebox, but she needed to establish a foundation of maternal warmth. She leaned against the counter and began an interrogation disguised as affection. She asked if the neighborhood was safe at night. She asked if I was sleeping well on the cheap metal bed frame. She looked at me with wide, concerned eyes and asked if I had enough money saved to cover the rent for the next few months all on my own. Every single question was a calculated psychological probe. She was testing my defenses, trying to gauge how desperate or lonely I might be feeling. She wanted to create a false sense of security, wrapping her true intentions in the soft blanket of a motherly check-in. I gave her short, neutral answers. I told her I was sleeping fine. I told her the rent was perfectly manageable. I leaned against the opposite wall, crossed my arms, and waited for the real reason she had driven across town. It took exactly 15 minutes for the maternal mask to slip. Lorraine let out a long, heavy sigh, the kind of theatrical exhalation she always used to signal an impending crisis. She shifted her weight, reached into her large leather tote bag, and pulled out a thick, familiar manila envelope. The sight of it instantly brought the metallic taste of adrenaline back to my mouth. She placed the envelope deliberately on the counter, right between the innocent green succulent and the box of sweet pastries. She started talking in a rapid, hushed voice. She told me Victor was completely falling apart. The commercial lenders were threatening to pull their credit lines entirely. The house in Arbor Creek was dangerously close to entering the pre-foreclosure process. As she spoke, her hands moved nervously, opening the clasp of the envelope and sliding the contents onto the counter. It was a graveyard of financial negligence. There were pink final notice slips from the utility companies. There were aggressive letters from the mortgage servicer printed on thick red paper. There were 2 separate past due invoices for the company work trucks. But the most insulting item was the final piece of paper she slid toward me. It was a freshly printed spreadsheet. Lorraine called it a temporary contribution plan. I stared at the grid of numbers. It was a highly detailed, itemized list outlining exactly how much of my monthly salary they expected me to directly deposit into their joint checking account. They had already budgeted my income to save their sinking ship. I looked at the small potted plant. I looked at the pink bakery box. They were nothing but cheap theatrical props. This entire visit, the soft voice, the fake concern about my sleep, it was all an elaborate Trojan horse. She had not come to check on her daughter. She had come to collect a debt I did not owe. Her goal was to sink a hook into my conscience and drag my wallet back to Arbor Creek. I opened my mouth to tell her to pack up her trash and leave, but before I could utter a single word, my smartphone, which was resting face up on the counter beside the mortgage notices, suddenly lit up brightly. A text message had just arrived. The sender name on the screen clearly read Noelle. The message was not meant for me. In her perpetual state of frantic distraction, my younger sister had selected the wrong contact in her phone. I looked down at the glowing screen. The text was incredibly short, but it contained enough poison to kill whatever lingering attachment I had left for my family. The message read, "Mom, did you delete the caption yet?" The air in the small apartment suddenly turned freezing cold. I stared at the words, letting their true meaning crystallize in my mind. The caption, The live stream on the night of my eviction was not just a silent video broadcast. There was text attached to it, text that needed to be deleted now that they realized I was building a legal case against them. I slowly picked up my phone. I did not break eye contact with Lorraine. I read the text message out loud, articulating every single syllable with absolute precision. "Mom, did you delete the caption yet?" Lorraine froze entirely. Her hand, which had been resting near the temporary contribution plan, slowly pulled back as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. The fabricated maternal warmth vanished from her face, replaced by the sheer, naked panic of a conspirator who had just been caught red-handed. I took a step closer to the counter, invading her space. I demanded to know exactly what the caption said. I demanded to know what foul, humiliating words my own sister had typed out and broadcast to the entire town while I was standing on the wet grass looking at my ruined belongings. Lorraine started to stammer. She physically backed away, bumping into the refrigerator. She tried to deploy her usual tactics of minimization and denial. She waved her hands frantically, claiming it was nothing serious. She swore Noelle had just made a foolish, immature joke in the heat of the moment. She tried to tell me that she had personally scolded Noelle for it later. Then, backed into a corner, Lorraine offered the most damning confession of her entire life. She admitted that she had seen the caption that night. She admitted she had stood on the porch, watched her youngest daughter type out a hateful public humiliation, and chose to say absolutely nothing. "I thought you would just get over it," Lorraine whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own guilt. "You always get over it. We just figured you would be angry for a few days. Forgive us, and come back to help fix the house." That single, pathetic sentence severed the very last invisible cord connecting me to my family. For weeks, I had allowed myself to harbor a tiny, naive sliver of hope that Noelle was simply a weak, easily manipulated bystander. I wanted to believe she was just a frightened kid caught in the gravitational pull of Victor's rage. But the mistaken text message destroyed that illusion forever. Noelle was not a victim of circumstance. She was an active, willing participant in my psychological abuse. She had eagerly grabbed a weapon and joined the firing squad. And Lorraine, the woman who brought me pastries and called my apartment cozy, had stood by and supervised the execution. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. The searing anger inside me condensed into something hard, cold, and diamond-sharp. I reached out and gathered the pink final notices, the mortgage threats, and the incredibly insulting temporary contribution plan. I stacked them together, tapped the edges evenly against the counter, and shoved them aggressively back inside the manila envelope. I picked up the envelope and held it out toward her. "Take your garbage," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Lorraine hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached out to accept the heavy envelope. She looked at the pink bakery box and the succulent, silently pleading for some sort of emotional compromise. "Take your plant. Take your cake. I am not your bank, and I am not your safety net." Lorraine clutched the envelope to her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer one last desperate, tearful apology, but I cut her off with a final, devastating truth. "Remorse that arrives with a payment schedule is not remorse," I told her, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "It is just an invoice dressed up as a family." Lorraine physically flinched as the words struck her. She had absolutely nothing left to say. Her entire manipulative architecture had been dismantled and laid bare. She awkwardly grabbed her oversized purse, picked up the plant and the bakery box, and hurried out the door without looking back. I stood in the quiet studio, listening to her footsteps echo down the dim hallway, entirely free. On a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 48 hours after my mother fled my small apartment, I walked into the main branch of the downtown post office. I approached the counter carrying a thick stack of heavy white envelopes. They were weighted down by years of documented financial exploitation and undeniable proof. My attorney, Mara Ellison, had been explicitly clear about our next strategic maneuver. We were no longer going to engage in exhausting, circular emotional warfare. We were going to wage a campaign of absolute administrative precision. The clerk behind the counter stamped each envelope with a heavy, satisfying thud, attaching the bright green tracking slips required for certified mail. I paid the postage fee of $32 in cash, recognizing it as the greatest investment I had ever made in my own freedom. The first two envelopes were addressed directly to Victor and Lorraine Garcia at the Arbor Creek residence. They were sent via certified mail, requiring a physical signature upon delivery, ensuring they could never claim the documents were lost in the transit. Inside each heavy envelope was a formal demand letter printed on the thick, textured stock of Mara Firm. Attached to the letter was a comprehensive, 6-page financial ledger. It meticulously listed every single personal loan I had disbursed to my parents over the past 60 months. Next to every single dollar amount, neatly organized by date and category, was a printed, high-resolution screenshot of their own text messages promising complete repayment. There was absolutely no room for creative misinterpretation. It was a cold, hard, legally binding invoice for their continued survival. The remainder of the envelopes were directed outward, aimed squarely at the structural load-bearing pillars of Sunline Exterior Services. I sent formal, notarized declarations to the regional wholesale lumber yards, the commercial liability insurance brokers, the heavy equipment rental agencies, and the digital payment processing gateways. The language contained within these documents was surgically precise and completely devoid of emotion. I stated unequivocally that I was not the operations manager of the company. I legally affirmed that I had never been an authorized financial officer or a designated guarantor. I formally and permanently severed my name, my personal contact information, and my pristine credit profile from Victor and his chaotic contracting business. This coordinated administrative strike was not an act of malicious sabotage. I did not illegally hack into their bank accounts. I did not vindictively cancel their active job site material deliveries. I simply removed the fraudulent scaffolding Victor had secretly built using my stolen professional identity. I stopped acting as his invisible legal and administrative crutch. The sheer, crushing weight of his own negligent business practices was now entirely his own burden to carry. The impact of the certified letters was instantaneous and devastating. By Thursday afternoon, my phone began to ring incessantly. Victor bypassed text messages entirely, resorting to a frantic, unhinged barrage of voicemails. The tone of his messages swung wildly like a broken pendulum. In the first 3 audio recordings, he was the enraged, tyrannical patriarch I had feared my entire life. He screamed so loudly into the receiver that the audio distorted, calling me an ungrateful, spiteful child who was intentionally trying to bankrupt her own flesh and blood. He demanded I immediately call the vendors and retract the legal notices. But by Friday morning, as the administrative holds actually began to lock his commercial accounts, his aggressive tone drastically shifted. The familiar arrogance completely evaporated. He started begging. The background noise of his later voicemails was filled with the echoing sounds of an empty warehouse and the panicked breathing of a trapped man. He pleaded with me to just make one quick phone call to his primary insurance broker to unfreeze a massive commercial roofing contract. The general contractor had officially suspended his crew pending an updated corporate officer verification, and Victor had absolutely no idea how to navigate the compliance portal. He was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare of his own making, entirely paralyzed without my invisible labor. Lorraine took a different, deeply predictable approach. She left a single, tearful, 4-minute voicemail. She utilized her softest, most wounded voice, a tone she had perfected over 3 decades. She accused me of tearing the family apart over a simple, tragic misunderstanding. She cried softly into the microphone, claiming my heart had turned to solid stone and that I was destroying the sacred bond of our household. For the first 34 years of my life, a message exactly like that would have sent me into a desperate spiral of crippling guilt. I would have abandoned my boundaries and rushed back to Arbor Creek to apologize for making her cry. But as I sat on my cheap metal bed and listened to her weeping, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation simply bounced off the cold, hard armor of reality I had finally built. I finally understood the brutal truth. When Lorraine used the word family, She was not describing a foundation of unconditional love and mutual support. She was referring to a parasitic structure of convenience. I was not tearing a family apart. I was simply resigning from my unpaid position as their full-time, highly abused crisis manager. The most satisfying silence of all came from the extended relatives. Aunt Dana Hurst and the loud bowling buddies who had stood on the front lawn and laughed at my public humiliation suddenly vanished into thin air. Word had quickly leaked through the highly efficient Arbor Creek gossip network that I had retained a ruthless corporate attorney. The rumor mill correctly deduced that I possessed a mountain of indisputable financial receipts, proving I had pumped tens of thousands of dollars into the Garcia household over the years. The very people who had gleefully mocked me as a worthless freeloader were suddenly terrified of being asked to open their own wallets to save Victor from drowning. Their loud, arrogant laughter from the night of the eviction party was completely replaced by a cowardly, self-preserving silence. They abandoned my parents the moment the entertainment ended and the actual bill arrived. Without my invisible labor and constant financial subsidies holding up the fragile roof, the daily reality of the Garcia household suffered a brutal, rapid downgrade. Noelle, who had spent her entire adult life treating her days like an endless, carefree vacation funded by my exhaustion, was abruptly forced to face the harsh, unforgiving mechanics of the real world. With Victor facing a total credit freeze and my wallet permanently closed, she had to finally secure actual employment. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she was now working 4 days a week behind the brightly lit register of a local strip mall cosmetics store. She was forced to stand on her feet for 8 hours a day, wearing a stiff uniform name tag, dealing with irritable customers, and finally learning the actual, exhausting value of a single dollar. Victor faced a punishment that was far more severe than physical labor. The proud man who had always loudly boasted that administrative tasks were just little chores meant for secretaries was now drowning in them. He was forced to sit alone at the messy kitchen table late into the night, wearing the reading glasses he always refused to wear in public. He had to squint at complex tax compliance forms, attempt to navigate labyrinthine insurance underwriter portals, and spend hours arguing with automated customer service representatives. He was finally being crushed by the massive, invisible workload I had managed flawlessly and silently for over a decade. I never posted a single word about the situation on any social media platform. I did not engage in a loud, messy public unmasking to defend my reputation against their initial lies. The absolute truth did not require a dramatic internet audience to be effective. The deafening, permanent void I left behind, combined with the crushing, undeniable weight of legally binding paperwork, was more than enough. My family had explicitly demanded a cruel public spectacle on their front lawn, but their true, lasting punishment was delivered quietly, efficiently, and mercilessly through the United States Postal Service. They were finally choking on the bitter, unfiltered taste of their own daily consequences, and I did not have to lift a single finger to watch them fall. The transition from frantic begging to outright hostility took exactly 3 days. Once Victor realized my attorney was not bluffing and the administrative walls were permanently closed around his company, his panic mutated into a desperate, cornered rage. He stopped leaving pathetic voicemails and instead had a cheap local strip mall lawyer draft a formal cease and desist order. The document arrived at my apartment via standard mail, a flimsy piece of paper compared to the heavy certified envelopes I had deployed. The letter officially accused me of tortious interference with a commercial enterprise. Victor was threatening to file a massive civil lawsuit against his own daughter, claiming my sudden withdrawal of communication had intentionally sabotaged his roofing contracts and caused him severe financial harm. He demanded I immediately rescind my notices to his vendors or face him in court. I brought the pathetic threat straight to Mara Ellison. She did not even offer it the dignity of a formal desk review. She read it while standing by the office window, let out a short, dry laugh, and immediately drafted a counter-response that was a masterpiece of legal suffocation. Mara fired back a razor-sharp document clarifying the absolute boundary between business interference and basic self-preservation. She stated in clear, unyielding terms that I had simply revoked the unauthorized use of my personal identity and private credit profile. Any catastrophic disruption to Sunline Exterior Services was entirely the result of Victor building his entire corporate infrastructure on the uncompensated, undisclosed labor of his child. You cannot sue a hostage for finally cutting their own ropes. Furthermore, Mara explicitly highlighted the digital transaction memos and the saved text messages, because those specific bank transfers were explicitly labeled as loans with concrete promises of repayment attached to every single time I rescued their mortgage. Victor could no longer hide behind the vague defense of a family gift. The indisputable paper trail forced him out of the realm of cheap moral outrage and dragged him kicking and screaming into the cold arena of binding contract law. He had to enter serious settlement negotiations, or we would proceed with aggressive collection tactics. While Victor was losing his fabricated corporate war, the foundational ground beneath the Arbor Creek property finally gave way. The primary mortgage lender, having received zero communication and zero funds for months, issued their absolute final demand. The official notice was delivered. If the massive cash flow deficit was not entirely resolved within a 14-day grace period, the family home would be forcefully accelerated into a mandatory public auction. The bank did not care about Victor losing his pride or Lorraine shedding tears. They only cared about the outstanding principal balance. The impending loss of the physical house sent a massive shockwave through the extended family network. The very same relatives who had happily attended my public crucifixion suddenly found my phone number again. Aunt Dana and the uncles began leaving me heavily scripted voicemails. The cruel, mocking laughter from the lawn party was completely gone, replaced by a sickening, thick layer of cheap manufactured morality. They tried to lecture me about the sacred duty of a child. They told me that blood is thicker than water, and that no decent person would ever allow their aging parents to lose the roof over their heads over a petty squabble. I listened to their hypocritical sermons while making my morning coffee, completely unbothered. They were perfectly willing to let me be publicly humiliated to save the house, but the moment they were asked to contribute a single dime to stop the auction, they resorted to attempting to guilt me back into my role as the human shield. Right in the middle of this suffocating pressure cooker, Noelle reached out. She did not send a manipulative text or a demanding voicemail. She asked to meet me in person, entirely alone, at a quiet public park on the north side of town. I found her sitting on a green wooden bench near a dry fountain. She looked entirely different from the smug, phone-wielding girl on the porch. The arrogant spark in her eyes was completely extinguished. She looked exhausted, wearing the same stiff retail uniform from her new cosmetic store job. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of her new, unforgiving reality. I sat on the far edge of the bench, maintaining a clear physical distance. I did not ask how she was doing. I waited for her to speak. She did not attempt to defend Victor. She did not try to deploy the usual emotional theatrics Lorraine favored. Instead, she stared down at her scuffed sneakers and confessed the absolute darkest secret of the entire ordeal. She told me she knew about the commercial loan application before I ever pulled into the driveway that night. Victor had held a frantic family meeting in the kitchen that afternoon while I was still trapped at work. He explicitly outlined his plan. He told Noelle and Lorraine that the business was completely out of money. The work trucks were going to be repossessed, and the only possible salvation was forcing me to sign the guarantor documents. He told them he was going to throw my belongings on the grass and invite the neighborhood over to break my ego so completely that I would sign the papers just to make the nightmare stop. And Noelle had agreed to the plan. "I knew what he was going to do," she whispered, her voice trembling violently. "I knew it was wrong, but he told me that if you did not sign those specific papers, there would be absolutely no money left for my tuition. He said my car insurance would be canceled the next day. He said my entire life would stop. I just wanted to keep my things. I thought you would be strong enough to handle the embarrassment. I thought you would just sign it and save us like you always do." Genuine tears began to stream down her face. For the very first time in her entirely sheltered existence, she was not blaming Victor for his temper or Lorraine for her passive behavior. She was taking direct ownership of her own profound selfishness. She was sobbing over the undeniable fact that she had willingly traded her sister to a psychological firing squad just to ensure her tuition bill was paid and her gas tank remained full. I sat completely still, absorbing the absolute finality of her confession. Her tears were real, but they possessed absolutely no healing power. The truth did not mend our fractured relationship. It merely illuminated the sheer depth of the rot. Her admission cemented the final, inescapable reality. I was never a sister to her, and I was never a daughter to them. I was a walking, breathing line of credit. I was a disposable asset to be managed, manipulated, and ultimately sacrificed whenever their own comfort was mildly threatened. I stood up from the wooden bench. I looked down at the girl weeping into her hands, feeling absolutely no urge to reach out and comfort her. I told her I appreciated the honesty, but that an apology delivered only after the bank accounts run dry is just a different form of begging. I walked away, leaving her alone by the dry fountain. Later that afternoon, I called Mara Ellison. The mortgage lender had scheduled a mandatory loss mitigation mediation, a final desperate attempt to resolve the debt before the property was officially seized. Victor and Lorraine were required to attend. I told Mara to officially inform the bank representatives that I would be present at the mediation table. I was not going to attend to offer a miraculous financial rescue. I was not going to sign a bridge note or write a massive personal check to save the Arbor Creek house from the auction block. I was going to walk into that sterile room to ensure every single loose thread was permanently severed. I was going to use their own undeniable paperwork, their own broken promises, and the absolute unvarnished truth to lock the door behind me forever. The mandatory loss mitigation mediation was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a rainy Thursday morning. The venue was not a cozy living room or a familiar local coffee shop. It was the sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room of the primary commercial lender located on the 20th floor of a downtown corporate high-rise. The setting was entirely devoid of any personal warmth, which suited my purposes perfectly. I walked through the heavy glass doors alongside my attorney, Mara Ellison. I carried my thick leather briefcase, the weight of it a comforting reminder of the undeniable facts I held inside. When we entered the room, Victor was already seated near the head of the massive mahogany table. He had worn his best suit, an obvious attempt to project an aura of financial stability and patriarchal authority. Lorraine sat to his left, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring blankly at the polished wood. Noelle was seated beside her, looking small and entirely defeated. To my absolute disgust, two of the loud uncles who had attended my eviction party were sitting in the chairs lining the back wall. Victor had undoubtedly invited them to act as his personal audience. He firmly believed he could still use his booming fatherly voice to intimidate me into submission, and he wanted witnesses to watch him put his ungrateful daughter back in her place. We took our seats on the opposite side of the long table. The bank-appointed mediator, a sharply dressed man with silver hair and absolutely no emotional investment in our family drama, sat at the head. He opened his laptop, reviewed the devastating financial deficits attached to the Arbor Creek property, and asked Victor for his proposed resolution. Victor immediately tried to play his final desperate card. He completely ignored the mediator and locked his eyes directly on me. He leaned forward, adopting a tone of deep, wounded disappointment. He said that demanding money from your own flesh and blood is a sickness. He claimed that people who tally up the cost of raising a family have completely lost their humanity. He spoke about sacrifice, duty, and the sacred bond of a household. He was attempting to perform a magical trick, trying to transform a cold, hard financial extortion plot into a vague, muddy moral debate where I was the villain for demanding accountability. The uncles in the back nodded in solemn agreement, eagerly swallowing the poisonous narrative. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single ounce of anger bleed into my expression. I simply opened the brass clasps of my briefcase. I pulled out the first thick manila folder and placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany table. I stated, with absolute clarity, that I was not seeking to turn a profit on my childhood. I placed the second folder down. I explained that I was not demanding compensation for being a daughter. I placed the third folder down. I looked directly into Victor's eyes and told him I was exclusively demanding the full restitution of the personal funds I was manipulated into spending to save his failing company, to rescue his defaulted mortgage, and to artificially inflate his public image over the past 5 years. The mediator flipped through the meticulously organized stacks of printed text messages, bank transfer confirmations, and direct emails. He saw the exact phrases Victor and Lorraine had used: temporary loan, we'll pay you back. Cover this just for now. The undeniable paper trail completely neutralized Victor Hollow moral grandstanding. Sensing the shift in the room, the mediator adjusted his glasses. He looked between the two sides of the table and asked a very direct question. He wanted to know what specific event had caused a seemingly cooperative family dynamic to fracture so violently that it required certified legal demands and corporate severance. Victor opened his mouth to spin another lie, ready to paint me as a volatile, spiteful child who had abandoned them over a minor argument. Before he could speak a single syllable, Mara Ellison took control of the room. She calmly stated that the breakdown was not the result of a family argument. It was the result of a premeditated coercion strategy. She opened her laptop, maximized the volume, and pressed play on the uncut digital audio file. The pristine acoustics of the corporate conference room amplified the sound perfectly. Victor's own voice, captured flawlessly on the night he threw my life onto the wet grass, echoed off the glass walls. After tonight, she will sign anything for some peace. The atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed the recording was absolute. The two uncles sitting in the back row, who had spent the entire morning glaring at me, suddenly stared at the floor. The cheap moral high ground they thought they were standing on completely collapsed. They finally understood that the lawn party they had so happily attended was never a mere disciplinary measure. It was a failed, malicious plot to legally bind me to a sinking ship against my will. They were not witnessing a family dispute. They were sitting in a room with a man who had tried to extort his own child. The mediator cleared his throat, entirely uncomfortable with the raw ugliness of the revelation, but sharply focused on the legal implications. He turned to Victor and Lorraine. He explained that the Arbor Creek property was severely delinquent and possessed absolutely no viable path to salvation. The house had to be sold immediately to satisfy the primary lender. However, if I decided to drag this documented fraud into a protracted civil litigation, the legal fees and court injunctions would freeze the asset entirely, draining whatever microscopic equity remained in the property. Lorraine finally broke. The sheer exhaustion of maintaining the facade, combined with the terrifying reality of total bankruptcy, crushed her remaining resistance. She reached out and grabbed Victor by the wrist, stopping him from launching into another useless, aggressive tirade. She looked at the mediator and quietly accepted the settlement terms. An official agreement was drafted right there at the table. It stipulated that the Arbor Creek house would be placed on the market immediately. After the primary bank loan and the mandatory closing costs were fully satisfied, a specific, non-negotiable percentage of the final net proceeds would be diverted directly into my personal accounts to satisfy the proven debt. They were signing away the last remaining shreds of their financial security to pay me back for the years I spent keeping them afloat. The mediator pushed the binding contract across the table. Victor stared at the paper as if it were a physical weapon. His face was a mask of pure, bitter defeat. He picked up the heavy black pen and signed his name on the dotted line, officially acknowledging his debt and his failure on the permanent public record. Noelle looked across the table at me. Her eyes were red and swollen. She whispered a quiet apology, her voice shaking with genuine regret. She finally understood the permanent cost of her silence on that porch. I looked at her, but I offered absolutely no comforting words. I did not promise a future reconciliation. I did not suggest that time would heal these specific wounds. Some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt. They are meant to be burned so you never have to cross them again. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I looked down at the signed settlement agreement resting on the polished wood. My childhood home, the place where I had spent a decade absorbing their stress and subsidizing their chaotic lives, had been reduced to nothing more than a simple transaction number on a piece of white paper. As I walked out of the glass conference room and headed toward the elevators, a profound, weightless peace washed over me. I finally understood the true nature of my retaliation. The ultimate revenge did not require screaming matches, public internet shaming, or explosive confrontations. The most devastating thing I could possibly do was absolutely nothing. I simply stopped saving them. I removed my invisible safety net, stepped completely out of the way, and waited patiently for the absolute truth to walk into the room, sit down at the table, and force them to sign their own names under the crushing weight of their own consequences. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, I would love to invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that the voice of this story can reach and be heard by many more people.